You might not have a marketing problem. You might have a strategy problem. You're not sitting in traffic. You are traffic. Pick your customer, pick your future. These are some of the ideas and so much more that I reflected on with my own career, with my own path in this episode of The Leadership Standard with our guest, the one and only Seth Godin. Now, I looked at these ideas, which these were 299 riffs, as Seth calls them, in the book, This is Strategy, Make Better Plans. Now, Seth is a 21-time best-selling author, entrepreneur, teacher, course creator. And let me tell you, when I put out on LinkedIn that I was going to speak with Seth, our community of tech entrepreneurs, CEOs, CEO advisory board group members, they had so many questions for you, Seth, that I'm going to work those into the second half. So, without further ado, thank you for being a guest on the show. It's a true honor to have you.
Well, I'm an honorary Canadian, so anytime that I can spend time, that's fantastic. Thank you for having me.
Seth, I'd like to start with what is strategy? Because a lot of people don't know or they have conflicting views on what it means.
Right. That's why I needed to write a book. Um, Strategy is not tactics. And there are a lot of books about tactics. They just call themselves discussions of strategy. That's not. Tactics are tasks. If you're a manager, you have power and authority to give people tasks. And if they do the tasks, you expect an output. We need tactics, but that's not strategy. Strategy is leadership. It's voluntary. It's a philosophy of becoming. It's our view of the future and the people we serve and the systems that we are part of. And I just had an article in the Harvard Business Review, and I quoted a study that showed that even CEOs of Fortune 500 companies spend far less than a day a week working on strategy. If you get your strategy right, the tactics work so much better. If you get your strategy right, the marketing takes care of itself. But if you skip it and you don't have the conversation, then you're just racing to the bottom.
Why do you think they don't spend as much time on strategy?
Well, for a few reasons. First of all, it's about the future, and the future is scary. Second, it might work. And if it works, then you're responsible. Third, it might not work. And then you feel terrible. It's so much easier to do what we've been indoctrinated to do since we were in elementary school all the way up to grade 13 and beyond. They never, ever ask you a question in school they don't already know the answer to. And so we've been trained that the way you move up is by doing what your boss says and getting the right answer. But strategy, there is no right answer. There's just a position, a chance to make things better.
A CEO advisor, Mark Taylor, who was a Vistage Chair of the Year, when I asked him about strategy, he said that with his experience in decades, first as a CEO and now as a top executive coach of CEOs, he said the biggest challenge and even complaint that they have when it comes to strategy is their teams are not strategic enough. How do you create the conditions to help CEOs or for CEOs to make their teams more strategic?
Yeah, I'm not going to let the CEOs off the hook. I think your teams are doing what you reward them for doing. And if you reward people for following instructions and hitting their numbers, why are you surprised that they're following instructions and trying to hit their numbers? That when you reward people for making good decisions that have unfortunate outcomes, they're more likely to make good decisions. If you reward people for having honest conversations about strategy, they're more likely to have honest conversations about strategy. But for example, at Blockbuster all those years ago, there were smart people who saw Netflix coming, but none of those people got rewarded for talking about it. And we can go down a list. Steve Ballmer had a huge number of problems. He's one of the worst high profile CEOs in recorded history. And it's because the people who worked for him were not rewarded for having strategy conversations. They were rewarded for doing their job.
What's a bad strategy?
Well, someone's going to win the lottery, but it's probably not going to be you. So if you're a small business person and you say, my goal is to be a, I don't know, TikTok influencer, and I'm going to do all the steps and follow all the procedures to do that because someone's going to get 50 million views. Yeah, but it won't be you. If you believe that one company in your industry is going to come out the other side by doing what they did yesterday, but trying really hard, that might happen, but it's probably not going to be you. And so what we see is that the status quo feels like a worthwhile strategy, but it almost never is. And, when we're thinking about a country like Canada, Canada is one of the top four producers of oil in the world. Uh, Canada has both an extraction economy and an intellectual economy and doesn't have a lot of people in it. And then all of a sudden, we introduce alternative energy, renewables, and AI. It's impossible to imagine that 10 years from now, the Canadian economy is going to be like it is now. It's going to change. And if you're going to fight for it to stay the same, you have a bad strategy.
In the book, you talk about transforming your relationship with strategy. You can start with doing one of two things. We're not going to talk about both. Let's just talk about the first one for now, which is you said start a group with 3 to 4 people in person or in Zoom. Make once a week assertions, highlights, fears, and sharing your path with this group. Now, you were on a call yesterday with Chip Conley, who's also been on this podcast, a
Mhm.
friend of 40 years, and you're both inspiring in the impact you've made with people like me and many millions of others around the world. One thing that Chip told me was that you created informally your own group at business school, which resulted in you writing your first book and also writing a book together shortly thereafter called Business Rules of Thumb. I could be a little bit off with some of my details, but to me, this was a similar idea of the dadists, the surrealists, the beat generation, just in your niche, in your area of expertise. And tech and the groups that they create across the country, which I'm a part of as a speaker, they also are creating these
Right.
groups, these
Exactly.
mastermind groups. So, my question to you is what is the best way to incorporate strategy into a mastermind group so that people use strategy in an effective way to help develop and grow their businesses and make change in the world?
I love that we're talking about this. You got the story exactly right, except for one key part.
Yeah,
Chip started the group, and Chip changed my life. Chip put a note in my box inviting me to that group. And if that hadn't happened, I promise we would not be talking right now.
really.
So the method is super simple. The method, it works at the kind of organization that you're a part of. It works at Vistage, and it also works at a conference. I was at a conference this morning with a bunch of entrepreneurs. Hey, what you working on? What's happening? And not one person brought up the hard part of their strategy that they were wrestling. They brought up, how am I going to get the word out about this? How can I hustle more about that? But what happens in these groups when you do it properly is this: all week, you're thinking about how you're going to report back to the group about what you changed with your strategy, what you learned about your strategy. And even if you missed the meeting, it had its purpose, which is you realize this is what we're going to be comparing, not how many sales did I close, not did I get picked up by some media outlet, not did I get 400 more followers on Instagram. These are tactics. But if we can honestly talk about our strategy. So I spend a lot of time talking to authors. How often do my fellow authors say, well, it's pretty clear that books are dying, that podcasts are rising but leveling off, that audiobooks are taking a big chunk. What is going to be my strategy for working in this world when the medium is different? It almost never comes up because instead, my friend, the literary agent, is just trying to sell as many great books as he can to book publishers before they disappear, as opposed to thinking about where his skills could go to good use somewhere else.
Yeah. And you also talk about Claude AI as a potential tool to help transform your relationship with strategy. You talk about using questions, lists, and challenges. Now, before you answer, right at the last riff, I think it's 297, which is one of my favorite riffs. You have You could call them a chapter, although they don't have page numbers. Questions that lead to strategies. And you have a series of questions, which I can't wait. I have a series of groups I'm speaking with next week, facilitating. Hopefully, with your permission, though I haven't asked, I want to talk about the book because it's
Sure.
inspired
No,
me.
it's
I want to
it's
incorporate.
for you.
I want to incorporate these. When you were talking about cloud AI as a uh, potential way to build this relationship with strategy moving forward, were you referring to connecting Claude AI, I'm jumping here, with questions like this?
Right. So let's just go over a couple of things. Most people listening have heard of ChatGPT, which is owned by OpenAI. I don't like ChatGPT. I think it's lazy and arrogant in equal measure. But Claude.ai is my best friend. Claude.ai is a thoughtful version of ChatGPT. What you can do is upload your strategy plan, your business plan, 10 pages, 20 pages, and then go through the list of questions and say, "Hey, Claude, did I do a good job of answering this question? Hey, Claude, ask me some questions like this one. Let me have a partner who I am not embarrassed to tell the truth to because it's a computer, who will iterate with me for 10 minutes and tell me the truth about what's missing from this based on these questions." So, what I describe in the book is you don't have to have a real life group if that's challenging for you or embarrassing. Go process it through Claude. Either you're working for AI or AI is working for you. And I promise if you are signing up to have a job where you work for AI, you're not going to get the dignity or respect you deserve.
Is it a tool you could also, referencing what I said at the very beginning, quoting you, pick your customers, pick your future? Is this a tool that you might recommend if used carefully and intentionally to also help you if you're not sure what your niche is or what your smallest viable audience is, as you call it?
Well, let's break this into pieces. What do I mean by pick your customers, pick your future? Uh, if you're a wedding photographer and you specialize in super, super expensive weddings, you're going to end up spending your days with really high strung people who are trying to put on a show that's going to stress them out. That's going to be your future, right? If you decide that as a consultant, you're going to be easy to find, cheap to hire, you're probably going to end up with people who don't value your work as much as if you focus on clients that seek out and respect people who are the best at what they do. It's harder, but once you're in, your days get better. So we get to pick our customers. If you're not regularly saying to someone, I can't really help you, call that person down the street, you've given up agency. So the next part of it then is not to think about niching down. I'm talking about niching up, being responsible and saying, I'm going to be the best in the world at this. And if you can describe what this is, if you're a stand up comic and you say, I appeal to audiences that like edgy humor in English who have had 3 drinks, then that's who you should go do your work for. And if someone criticizes you and they're not in that group, forgive them. Sorry, it's not for you. But if you need to please everyone and you want to be for everyone, then you're not on the hook. You can't be held responsible, nor can you be the best at what you do because lots of people want lots of different things. So the magic of the smallest viable audience is you know exactly who you're on the hook to. And yet, most of the organizations I talk to could not tell me in 3 sentences who they're for. Who is your customer?
You also said, and I didn't quote you, I put it in my own words, but that when organizations, both big and small, come to you and they talk about having a marketing problem, you sometimes suggest they look at their strategy first. Can you expand on what you mean by that?
Okay, so for most of my life, marketing and advertising were the same thing. That uh, an organization would run a bunch of ads, interrupt a lot of people, sell some things, and then make enough money to do it again. That you would rent a whole bunch of outlets on Highway 11, put up a bunch of Canadian tires, make enough money from selling stuff there to buy more rent and do it again. It all changed when TV and mass marketing went away. As a result, marketing isn't about advertising anymore. Marketing is, how do we tell a true story that spreads, that resonates, that causes people to take action? And often when people get frustrated or stuck, they say, how do I get the word out? How do I tell more people? This is never the right answer because it's harder and harder to get the word out. The right answer is to produce something for the smallest viable audience that's so remarkable and irresistible they tell their friends. And so the word spreads horizontally. And then people who would miss you if you were gone show up for more. That is a strategy. And once you get your strategy right, marketing looks easy.
In the book, you wrote, I didn't write the book so you would buy it, but so we can start talking about strategy, talking about the change we seek to make, about the systems that are around us, having conversations with our teams about games, about empathy, about time. If it's okay with you, what I'd like to do is touch upon each of these areas briefly in context to strategy, starting with systems.
Right.
You describe a system as whenever we work together, a system is created. Can you expand on what a system is in context to strategy? And as we spoke of just briefly when we logged on, I'd love to talk about the chocolate industry system as an example.
Sure. So the easiest one before we get to chocolate is the answer to the question, how much should a wedding cost? And the answer is exactly as much as my best friend plus a little more. And that's how you end up with $100,000 weddings. Not because the salmon and the round tables and the loud band and the flowers are necessary to have a happy marriage, but because this invisible system puts cultural pressure on us to do it again. So, chocolate, which has been around as a luxury product for 400 years or so, uses cacao. Cacao is a fruit, grows on a tree. Almost all the cacao in the world comes from the Ivory Coast in Ghana. And there are a couple different kinds of trees. And one tree is more productive and it makes lousy cacao pods. They're lousy, normal, commodity, unremarkable, and thus cheaper because you can make a lot of it. So Nestle's and Cadbury's and Hershey's push farmers in these countries to grow as much cheap commodity cacao as they can. It means that many of the people who farm cacao are some of the poorest in the world, making $3 to $5 a day. There's an enormous amount of child slave labor involved. And the chocolate system is filled with people, few of whom are evil, who are all just doing their job. So we just passed Halloween. And so at Loblaws and at lots of other supermarkets, hey, we got to stack the little fun packs because that's what our customers want to buy. And the people who make the stuff say, these kids don't care if it tastes amazing. We got to make what the customers want to buy. And all the way down, everyone is part of this invisible system. So a guy named Tony is a journalist in uh, whatever they call the place where Dutch people live, Amsterdam.
Amsterdam. Yeah.
And he writes a series of articles to shame the chocolate companies into changing what they do. And it has no effect because the system is really good at defending itself. And so he starts a chocolate company and he named it Tony Chocolonely because he's lonely because this is hard. And he now makes 25% of all the chocolate in the Netherlands. The lesson here is the system can change, but it doesn't change from the center. It always changes from the edges. And my friend Sean Askinozy was the second bean to bar chocolate maker in the US. I just did a collaborative chocolate bar with him for the book. And he is doing the same thing. He pays the farmers 5 times the going rate. He visits them personally every year and on and on and on. We can change the system, but first we have to see it. And so there's the military industrial complex and the college industrial complex. There's the system of logging that led to Algonquin Park being founded. And you can paddle your way from Canoe Lake on and not see a logging truck, but they're there. And they're the ones that leveraged and lobbied and paid for it to happen. And so when we think about things in our past that we might not be proud of, right? The tragedy of what happened with First Peoples, that's because they were victims of a system. And we can highlight outputs all we want, but the system's going to keep doing what the system is doing until we change the system itself.
Yeah, and I was sharing with you just before we got on too that Tony Chocolonely, when I was at an Amsterdam conference for entrepreneurs, it was on the table of every group. And I asked someone, "What is this? This really brightly colored font?" And they said, "Well, it's a Amsterdam success story." And it turned out that they were one of the sponsors of this event. And I think I gained about 7 good pounds because I did not stop eating that chocolate. So it's an interesting coincidence. Um, so thank you for that. The second one is games. One way you describe it briefly is multiple players are and different possible outcomes. What is the connection between games and strategy, and why should it matter?
Well, first, calling it a game makes our life easier because we've been trained to understand that games aren't always a matter of life and death. Games have moves in them. If you make a move and it doesn't work, it's not because you were a bad person. It's because you made a move that didn't work. Make a different move. So we need to see the potential moves. For example, if I want to get something onto the shelves of a chain of stores, I got to get something else off the shelf because there's only a finite number of spaces. So when I move to lower my price, what's my competitor going to do? They might make a move to lower their price. And now you can see how the game will unfold. And when we think about all the choices we have to make, they are decisions, decisions with outcomes. And if we can treat this the way we understand games, we'll make better decisions. And that's really what we do for a living is we make decisions.
Empathy. You talk about empathy as how other people make choices. You said people don't see or even want what you want. This surprised me because I had in my mind your pain in my heart, this evolved idea of what I've been taught, even what I teach in difficult conversations with what empathy is. So it's just one of many ways where you got me thinking differently and reflecting on what I thought I knew within a business context. Seth, can you reflect a little bit on what you meant by empathy in connection to strategy?
So I'm in favor of kindness, and empathy and kindness usually come together. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the simple realization that you cannot command other people who have choices to do what you want. All you can do is create the conditions for them to do what they want. And when we see an organization stumble, it's because they think they have so much power, they can just insist. Or when they're so caught up in their point of view about the world, they just assume everyone else agrees with them. But where we are most effective is if we realize that the person we are offering this choice to doesn't have to do what we said, but we can imagine what it's like to be them and create the conditions for them to want to do what we need. But if we're not extending ourselves in that way, it's not going to happen.
And finally, time. Strategy plays out over time in a way a garden grows. One example you gave was a podcast, something that I find has helped me develop my business because I have multiple podcasts. Can you talk a little bit about that example or others when it comes to what you mean by time in connection with strategy?
Sure. So the first time how many episodes are we in on this podcast? Hundreds, right?
Well, before me, there were more. My time here, it's been about 14.
Oh, okay. So which is the first podcast you started?
I started another podcast and I'm 42 episodes in.
42 episodes. Episode one, how many people listened to it?
Not very many.
Yeah, like your mother-in-law and your cousin Morty.
Yes.
And you don't stop then. You do episode 2, and if it's what it needed to be, those 3 people told 6 other people, and then it grows and it grows and it grows and it grows. So even the biggest podcasts in the world, that's how they got to be big podcasts. Every problem that's worth solving starts with a small solution, not a big one. And then we give it the fertilizer and the room to grow until it becomes a big solution. So, what we need to do is factor time into how we are making our choices. Will the you of 2 years from now send you a letter back through time and say, "Hey, Jamie, thanks for doing that 2 years ago. It's really what we're counting on for today." That part of us thinks that we are the product of our past, but maybe the future is counting on us to create it. And what we have to do today is envision what we're going to need in 5 years and do that now.
And you spoke about this yesterday with Chip, I believe. It might have been Chase Jarvis. I've been listening to you, so my different examples
They all
are
blend together.
they're
Yes.
all blending. But you talked about imagining you're looking back at yourself at 2019,
Right.
right, and then looking forward. Can you clarify that, because I really like that example for this audience, that
Sure.
exercise.
Well, so if you're a professional, you're here to do something hard. And if you're going to follow the well trod, easy path, we don't need to pay you what we're paying you or treat you the way we're treating you. What a professional is able to do is experience and exert emotional labor to get through these moments that are tricky. So, yeah, it's 2024. 5 years ago, just before COVID, each of us did something that made it easier for us for the last 5 years. And 5 years from now, when it's 2029, when the Earth's temperature is much higher, when AI is much more powerful, when the world is even crazier than it is now, what will we be able to say we're glad we did all those years ago as an organization or as an individual? And none of those things are going to be things that were emergencies or urgencies. They're just going to be things that were important.
Seth, one of the things I love about this book, and I found it so helpful as a creative minded person, is it was nonlinear. It was elliptical. You could pick it up at any place and derive the value that you projected into what you needed in that moment. I mean, so much so that even though this is mostly a podcast, there's still YouTube. I have been creating these boards based on
Wow.
the book that have helped me greatly with a few areas moving forward into 2025. And one of the areas that I was fascinated with was status, which you mention over 50 times in this book of riffs. Can you talk a little bit about the central component of systems and strategy you called status? And you gave examples like Hollywood, for example, produces affiliation and status. Why does status matter in business today?
Well, most strategies are based on helping people fulfill or fill an insatiable desire. That if you are on to something where people always want more of it, it's significantly easier for you to do your work. What are the insatiable desires? They are status, affiliation, freedom from fear. Status is who eats lunch first, who's up and who's down. Maybe it has to do with money, but not usually, right? That status is, oh, that person is the head of the Chamber of Commerce, or oh, that person is better at log rolling than me. Status is everywhere we look. Affiliation is who's to my left, who's to my right. That if I walk into someone's house in Hamilton and I mention a double double, they look at me like I'm a neighbor. If I say that to someone in New York, what the heck's a double double? And so affiliation is I feel I'm among people, right? And the freedom from fear is pretty obvious. So what we need to do to create the conditions with empathy to help people get what they want is either offer them status or offer them affiliation. Or the flip side of that, because if we're making change, we have to create tension, the tension of losing status or losing affiliation. And that's why just before the tickets sell out at a concert, people get more interested because they don't want to be left behind, right? That's why culture evolves because we want to be part of something together. And that reinforces systems and culture, which reinforce status, which reinforces affiliation, and around it goes over time.
Seth, I started this conversation by saying that this community of CEO advisory board group chairs, CEOs, and key executives had questions for you. So, for our remaining time together, what I'd love to do is ask you a few of these questions
Terrific.
directly from the people in the community. The first question is from Christoph Pop, and he says, "The greatest challenge that follows a strategy is execution. and people change management. What can we do at the strategy phase to be sure that we have solid footing to implement?
So there's an old New Yorker cartoon in which the physics professor has written a lot of math on the board. And then at the bottom of the board, it says, and then a miracle happens. You want to not have that built in when we're talking about leading and managing people. That any strategy that involves a step that says someone superhuman does something unexpected without adequate training or compensation is flawed. What we're seeking to do instead is create the conditions where ordinary humans doing their best can add up to something that becomes resilient. So if I think about a company like Patagonia, which is a fine, resilient long-term strategy, nobody knows the name of any of the designers at Patagonia. Nobody is counting on someone at Patagonia, a single person, to come up with a breakthrough that no one's ever heard of before. Instead, they've created the conditions for people who are adequately supported and trained to produce the next generation of what they need. And too often, bosses lacking empathy for their teams don't give them the resources to do the work that needs to be done. And then they decide, oh, human resources is the problem. Human resources isn't the problem. It's that you were greedy with your strategy. You didn't hire enough people, train them enough, give them enough time to do the thing you said was going to work over time.
The next question by Chief Executive Brian Thomas. How can leaders distinguish between strategic choices that create lasting positive change versus those that just feel urgent in the moment?
Right. That's the question. If you wrote down that question and put it on the corner of your monitor, everything about what you do would get better. That the hard work is all right. So many people know the story of the Marshmallow Test, but it's worth repeating to understand what really happened. Marshmallow Test was done many, many years ago. And it sounds cruel because I think it is. But you take a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, you put them in a library at a university, and the experimenter walks in with a marshmallow. And he says to this kid, here's a marshmallow. I'm going to put it right here, and I'm going to go away for 20 minutes. When I come back, if you haven't eaten the marshmallow, I will give you 2 marshmallows. And what they found is that kids who waited for 2 marshmallows over the course of the next 20 years, when they followed them, over 20 years, were happier, had better grades in school, made more money, and on and on and on. So some people think, oh, well, the lesson is uh, you got to raise kids to not eat the marshmallow. Well, what's missing from this story is if you grow up in a house where there's not enough to eat, if you grow in a house where there's food insecurity, you have adults who have made promises to you that were not kept. You have adults who served you a bowl of cereal for dinner because that's all that was in the house. And they meant well, but they were a victim of a system that wasn't giving them what they needed. So if some adult says, I'll come back with 2 marshmallows, you don't believe them. You just eat the damn marshmallow, right? Well, the same thing is true for what happens to us at work. At work, there's all these rewards for eating the marshmallow, not waiting for the second one. And so, what we need to do is for ourselves and for our employees, eliminate false proxies, create the conditions where we're going to measure the right thing and ignore the wrong thing. So, for example, I haven't read my Amazon reviews in 10 years. And the reason is because I've never met an author who read all their 1-star reviews and it made them a better writer. It doesn't work that way. If I'm not going to read my 1-star reviews, I can't read my 5-star reviews. So all a 1-star review tells me is this book isn't for you. It's written in a language you don't understand. So my editor sent me a review. I wish they hadn't. And this person gave me 1 star because the book is elliptical, not in an organized taxonomy. Exactly the opposite of what you liked about the book. My smallest viable audience wants the book the way you want it. This person was the wrong person reading the book. And if I was trying to always make that kind of person happy, I would write boring, mediocre, average, middle of the road, forgettable business books like so many people do because they're trying to please everyone. And instead, I'm saying, you know what? I'm willing to find 2 marshmallows and not race around putting out little campfires, but instead create the conditions to get where we need to go. So if you wanna be the leader you say you are, you've got to insulate yourself from the false proxies, and you've got to set yourself up for the smallest viable audience and do the important work.
And finally, to what extent should strategy be static or fluid? That was a question by John Berghoff of Exchange.
Great question, John. Tactics must be fluid. Tactics are part of our game. Tactics are we see this, we do that. We see this, we do that. We see this, we do that. Some organizations are brittle and break because they can't even change their tactics. And you can visualize those right now. But strategy needs to stick with us until the system we're in changes fundamentally. So, higher education had the same strategy for 400 years. It needs to change now because the system of learning, thanks to AI and the internet, is completely different than it was for all those years. But along the way, they changed their tactics all the time, right? But the insatiable desire they were filling is, do you want the status that comes from an accredited degree? Do you want the affiliation that comes from going to a football game with your friends? Status and affiliation, done. But now they're going to need to shift their strategy. And so when we think about the changes in the world, I believe the next 20 years are going to be in alternating moments about AI and about climate. And there's going to be noise about a lot of other things, but those two things are the Moore's law of our moment. And if you have a strategy that ignores those two, it's going to need to change. If you have a strategy that acknowledges those two, it could stick around for a long time.
Seth, where can we find this book and any other components that are connected to it?
Okay, so there's the chocolate bar. There's also this deck that I made that people really love. I've hardly talked about it at all. The deck you can get along with the book and the chocolate at seths.blog/TIS, which stands for This is Strategy, or you could go to Indigo or wherever finer books are sold for the book. But again, if you just talk about it, I'll be a happy camper. Just talk about it.
Seth, I'm definitely going to talk about it. And even though, like you said, you don't read reviews, this was a 5-star review from me to you. It was transformative. It's helped me look at my strategy, totally change my mindset on what strategy is and how to apply it and how to think it through. And I know our audience is going to appreciate it and be transformed in their own ways. So it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thanks so much for being a guest today on the Leadership Standard, Seth
So
Godin.
thank you. Keep making a ruckus, everybody. I appreciate you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Leadership Standard Podcast, brought to you by Tech Canada. Tech Canada's proven process of peer advisory groups, one-to-one executive coaching, thought leadership from subject matter experts, and national and global networks all provide a lasting impact. Not just on your business, but on your life. Your ability to deal with fast-paced change will accelerate. Your decision-making will become more decisive. You'll be a better leader. Learn more at tec-canada.com. Keep leading with excellence, and see you next time on the Leadership Standard Podcast.